It's amazing to see everyone who is joining here. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. We are really pleased to see you. We have our videos on off because we are showing the video of the sign language interpreter, and we are trying not to have our videos interfere with that. So that's the main reason why our videos are off. But we still hope that we'll be able to have an interactive conversation with everybody. My name is Dina Nawire, and I'm going to just take this opportunity to formally welcome us all. We see you as you're joining. Thank you so much for introducing yourself on the Padlet. We are pleased to see the individual African women, the representatives of African women's rights organizations, practitioners, knowledge creators, storytellers, digital content creators. We see you, we recognize you, and we are grateful that you've made the time to join this session. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the partners that have led this event to welcome you all. So on behalf of the African Women's Development Fund, on behalf of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, and on behalf of Raising Voices, please feel welcomed. We are going to, I think we can now end the screen share for the Padlet. We'll get back to it as the number grows of people who are introducing themselves, and then we can just go through the program. Thank you. And so we are going to be doing two main things today. One of the things that we are going to be doing is unveiling a guide for knowledge and evidence in the context of prevention of violence against women. And we think this is a great tool that's critical in highlighting and clarifying the how and why of creating and using knowledge and evidence, or even just clarifying how we understand what we call proof in the context of violence against women prevention. But the other important thing that we're going to do is to delve into conversations around the framing of issues and considerations for knowledge and evidence that is led by African women and African women's rights organizations. And our agenda is structured along those lines. So first, we are going to listen to one of the main authors of the Knowledge and Evidence Guide, who will be speaking to us about reflections from her writer process, and also highlighting some key aspects of the guide that are critical for users, for the movement, and the general field of violence against women prevention. And then we shall also have an amazing panel, please stay around, of 3 speakers who are going to be sharing their thoughts. And they come from a very rich background, expertise, etc. And so it's an exciting panel that you should be looking out for. And then we shall have a Q&A session after the first presentation of the Knowledge and Evidence Guide and the panel presentation. We shall have a question and answer session where we shall be able to get your thoughts and contributions on the presentations that will have been made. And that will lead us into the closing section. So without further ado, I would like to once again thank you for making the time to join this webinar and to invite Jen Bennett, who is one of the lead authors of the Evidence and Knowledge Creation Guide, to share with us her reflections and experiences with the process, but also around decolonization of knowledge and evidence in the context of prevention of violence against women. Welcome, Jen, and please feel free to start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dina. And I'm not sure about switching on my video. Maybe I should just switch it on for one, so that you can see that I'm alive and I'm here and that I'm smiling. That's me. I'm in very chilly, in a village, very chilly outside Cape Town. And it's a huge pleasure to be with you all in Nairobi, virtual Ghana, virtual Harare. I see so many people coming in through in the Padlet, and I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this event. I do have a slideshow. It's not a very fancy one, but I thought it might help to anchor some of the points that I'd like to make. So I'm going to stop my video and ask that the slideshow can be put into share screen. Just to check in with that.
Sorry, Jane, we are going to open it for you right now.
Oh, no problem, no problem. I thought maybe I'd done something stupid.
No. All right, are you able to see my screen? Not yet?
Not yet, on the way.
All right, I'm just going to stop it and then start again.
There
we go.
Was that the first slide?
Sorry, Jane, it's not letting me share properly from my side.
That's right.
There we go. There we go. Can you see it now?
Thank you. You can see it's a much more respectable looking slide. And once again, I want to thanks, Lisla. It's a great honor to be invited by AWDF to be part of this presentation. And we're opening it through the introduction to this, this guide, which is, I guess, being sort of launched or birthed or shared with the world today. And I'm asked to be on the panel in my role as an author. But I want to be very clear from the beginning that I was one of several authors, and that the process of creating this guide, which is entitled Generating Knowledge and Evidence on the Prevention of Violence Against Women, that process was a very collaborative one, especially with Dina Nabwire and Ponzo Mafete, but also with other people who had thought about these issues long before we got to creating the guide. Could I have the next slide? So yes, here's this one. If I'm saying I'm not really the key author, I'm an author in a collective. Yes, this is the picture I use to introduce myself to my students. I'm somebody who works at the University of Cape Town in South Africa in the African Gender Institute. And I want my students to have a clear idea that what you see might not be what you get, particularly when you're thinking about African feminisms. You need to have your eyes open, and there's always somebody behind you. And I also have worked far beyond this particular locale in a range of institutes and NGO and activist settings across the continent. And it's from those settings that I think I've learned the most about, both about violence against women and about what it means to commit one's energies to its prevention. Next slide, please. So I think I'm iterating my thanks, and my thanks go to actually primarily for this presentation, the number of voices that were funneled into a publication from AWDF, which predates this one. And that's a publication. Could I have the next slide, please? That was entitled, whoops, something missing. Maybe let me go back a step. Yes, I should have told you what I was going to talk about. Apologies. The shape of my very brief reflections here are going to be in relation to the process of creating the guide, and then to spend a little bit of time that I'm hoping the panel discussion can put more flesh and color into on what are challenges for us in African contexts around the prevention of gender-based violence, violence against women, when it comes to what we call evidence creation, the creation of stories, information, resources that show us not simply the size and shape and overwhelming pain of violence against women, evidence of how it can be prevented. And I'll do a bit of where to next. So could I have the next slide? So what I was saying before I made that little misjump was that my thanks in terms of talking about process of creating this introductory guide really go first and foremost to what was called a primer created by African Women's Development Fund and Raising Voices, the NGO, where they took time to talk about the importance of knowledge generation in the process of understanding the meaning of violence against women. Can I have the next slide? That's the URL, that collation. And where that collation took us was a number of commitments. These are commitments made prior to the guide that we're now going to be talking about. Where the Raising Voices took us was in documenting the need, this is to a commitment to document and share experiences in violence against women prevention, to deepen our understanding of what that would mean through a feminist analysis of violence against women, and to nurture a feminist organizational culture. We wanted to read and learn more about the evidence to contribute to further knowledge production, to encourage and support and promote innovation, to collaborate, to advocate for sustainable resource base, and very critically, and I think that this is such an important note, the note on which Raising Voices concludes actually, in order to create knowledges around the prevention of violence against women, there was a commitment to fostering self-care, to build solidarity across feminist networks. I just want to say something about that note of self-care, particularly for everybody listening here who's come on a very, very busy Thursday, no doubt with issues buzzing around our heads that have to do with what our desks look like, our kitchen looks like, our children look like, what it is we have to do in terms of our political and community responsibilities. And we've seen over and over again the words care colonized, if you like, by a capitalist, consumer-based consciousness. You only have to click into a Google site to be inundated with buy this shampoo, get this stuff to make your hair this way and that way, give yourself a massage, self-care. It's become part of, if you like, a consumerist agenda. That's not what Raising Voices means by self-care, although massage is a very good idea. Our versions of self-care do involve immense support for self-love, appreciation for our bodies as they are, and simultaneously for our well-being through collective care. That self-care is collective care and vice versa. So the process of thinking again about what it takes to create knowledges that help us prevent violence against women begin from the kickoff point of Raising Voices, which is about a radical African feminist version of self-care. Could I have the next slide? So we moved from there when we were thinking about this guide to ask what was our next challenge? What did we want to create in this new initiative? We wanted to offer a deeper review of the actual methods and tools available to feminist and African women-led organizations on the continent, multilingual as we are, multi-contextual, and with hugely diverse access to resources. What would it mean? What does it mean to say, generate resources by creating knowledges that help you to see how to prevent gender-based violence if we don't simultaneously offer some tools to do that? And if we don't offer, next point, some discussion of how to integrate knowledge creation and evidence creation into our organizational cultures. And we needed to think more, because we always need to think this and to debate it and to sit with it, to get pleasure from it, to worry about it, what it is that makes knowledge creation processes feminist in African context. And when I say African, I'm wary of the word because of the way it synergizes us, and often so much in Northern discourses, it synergizes us in dangerous and limiting ways. We are so diverse. We are full of stories which mix and match and speak to and with one another, and sometimes against one another. and retaining that pleasure in the diversity and complexity of the word African is for me something of a lifelong commitment and passion. But those were our challenges as we moved into the guide. Give a deeper review of methods, discuss how to integrate the work into our own organizational cultures, and continue to think about what makes knowledge creation processes feminist. Could I have the next slide? So, what's the point of doing this? We won't have time in this presentation to actually look in depth in any way at the guide. But given that we wanted to take up those challenges, what did we think was the point of it? How would this, in some people's language, add value to the work that we're all doing? One of the things we thought might be very, very helpful was for us to work towards the creation of a shared language. And I don't mean an actual language. We speak so many languages, and even those under interpretation today don't begin to reflect the number of languages with which we're all conversant. But if we can start to think together about a language of knowledge creation, it's a political language, it's a language also of support for cross-contextual solidarity. If we have something of baseline, even if we turn in discussion to redraw it all together, let's at least try and have something that we can share. And we saw this as a route towards building programs which can integrate knowledge generation into other forms of work. One of the key challenges I think we all face in organizational day-to-day work is how very demanding it is, how very time-consuming. And sometimes we call this crisis-driven, but it's actually life-driven. You know, there are so many ways in which our lives are, for all the ways that they are full of joy and pleasure, are also crisis lives. They are open to surprise, to consternation, to pain, to difficulty, because of the work that we've chosen to engage with, the prevention of violence against women. So sometimes we feel, I think, or I've heard, I've felt it myself, that the challenge to create knowledges, particularly in resource shareable forms like this, is just one too many tasks. It's just how. So we wanted to share this guide in order to offer a route to doing this, or an idea of a route. Could I have the next slide, please? There are challenges. We know I've talked about the challenges that have to do with the internal cultures of organizations, rich, busy, sometimes feeling chaotic, exhausted leadership, and even more exhausted people reaching out and developing programs. Those are critical challenges. The word self-care comes to mind again. How would that get integrated into those internal challenges? But what of some external challenges? Some of us are very familiar with those. There's a huge dominance of Northern research economies in our spaces, economies in which very often some of us might find ourselves as sites for Northern funded research, that we are the cases. We also often required, should we accept funding from certain Northern research contexts, we're required to use certain sorts of methods. We're required to work at their, if you like, behest in terms of what. Oh, I'm seeing something in the chat. It feels a bit disembodied hearing a voice. Would you rather I put my video on again? I can do that. I'll do it. Thanks, Mishka. Here I am again. Challenges of pace and priorities, what we're supposed to be doing first and how, and challenges of politics and ethics. I'm not going to unpack these at length, but knowledge creation is always involved with questions of power, and we're always working against what I would call hegemonic knowledges. Hegemonic knowledges in the development world have now actually come to encompass the idea that violence against women is damaging, a violation of human rights, etc., etc. So we find ourselves particularly challenged. We no longer have to fight and fight and fight to actually put violence against women on critical agendas. Means on the agendas, how we are seen, whose interests are served when we bring up the realities of gender-based violence. That becomes a difficult political game, and there are profoundly complex ethics that go along with that. Could I have the next slide, please? To address, so to address these, we think very much in terms of working with African feminisms, where it was BC Adelaide Famei actually several years ago who suggested that feminism has established itself, this is a quotation from a talk she gave, as an experimental laboratory for integrating ethics and social responsibility into scholarship. Now, what that means is that when we're thinking about, say, tools for knowledge creation, one of the questions we always have to be asking is, what is a tool and what makes it feminist, and what makes it feminist in the interests of the prevention of violence of women? This is something the guide tries to talk about a lot, the array of tools involved and the ways in knowledge creation and the ways in which those can be deployed as feminist. So you think about a tool as simple as storytelling, the storytelling that might an organization understand how a particular prevention initiative had worked or not worked. Well, what would make that feminist? And it's not simply a case of, well, listening to women rather than listening to men. In fact, it might not be that case at all. It means one is listening always for the subterranean. Which women? The marginalized. Which women? We may not be looking at what it is that we are told by the story leadership about the success of their policies. We might need stories that come very far from, if you like, the thrones or the seats of leadership. Who do we think of as women? Are we remembering to include sex workers in the stories from whom we can learn about policies? Are we remembering always disabled women? Are we remembering the women who we don't know how to listen to because we don't know her language? We can't speak it. How can we find her? This is an example of how to integrate a feminist consciousness into tool and development for knowledge creation. You might think it's too hard. Organizations often say to me, where do we start? Where do we start? I would say start where you are. There is knowledge creation happening in every organization at every level. If I had more time, I would want to talk more about that. Can I just have the next slide? Where we're going with this, and this is an AWDF process, but it's also an us process. We're going towards the principles of inclusivity. How do we hear and include everybody in this work of preventing violence? How do we decolonize the idea that only certain people have access to authority, to texts that circulate widely, to fame as knowledge makers? We are all knowledge makers. We are all knowledge disseminators. We are all accountable, and we need each other so much. Thank you. I'm going to stop. I took a little extra time, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Jane. And just a reminder for everyone who's listening in, there is interpretation. You just click on the globe below and choose your language. And we've got Sylvia doing the sign interpretation. So you can just pin that video to your screen. Then I'm going to hand over to Dina, who will introduce the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lizzo. Could you, Omalaika, help to permit my video to show? I think I'm unable to show it.
You should be able to show it now.
Yes.
Great, wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you, everyone. Apologies, I didn't have my video on at the welcome session, but thank you, Jen, once again, and thanks everybody that is part of this event. I will be introducing very shortly a panel that is going to delve a bit more into some of the issues that Jen has highlighted. And just to quick status, in addition to what Jen shared, what we are hoping to achieve with the conversation through the panel and all of the discussions is really continuing to reflect on some of the traditional framing and power constructs around knowledge and evidence creation and use, but also thinking about the contribution of African women and African women's organizations and our collective thoughts for how to make the process more inclusive, but also more able to position us in a way that we have a say about what becomes knowledge and what becomes proof, whether it's proof of what works or proof of what doesn't work. So I will introduce the three amazing women who we are going to be listening to today. The first person I'm introducing is Lucky Kobugabe. Lucky works with Raising Voices, and she directly supports the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Network in Uganda. She's an amazing African feminist. Please stay on to hear from her. We're also going to have Chichi Undi. Chichi is, she works with Population Council as a senior associate, and she's also part of the board of governors at the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. Welcome, Chichi. And the last person I'm introducing on the panel is Ponso Mafifi. So Ponso is the director of programs at the African Women's Development Fund. So feel welcomed, and we are going to start this conversation. We've run quite over time. I'm just going to be asking each of you a question to help us start the conversation, and then we can go into the discussion around what we think on the conversation of inclusivity and decolonization of knowledge and evidence as it pertains prevention of violence against women. And I think based on the comments, I think it's fine for speakers to keep their videos on just for interactivity as well. So my first question, and I'm taking this as a first question, knowing that Jen has provided some broader context around this. It goes to you, Chichi. Chichi, you've done quite a lot of work in Eastern, Southern, Central Africa with regards to research, with regards to programming and practitioner level work on violence against women. And we're curious to learn from you what the challenges for African women's rights organizations in creating evidence and knowledge for violence prevention are from your experience, and just bearing in mind what Jen shared, but also based on actual insights from your work. Thank you. Chichi, please.
Thank you, Dina. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm so sorry, I would love to keep my camera on, but I don't know if you noticed it was freezing, and I am terrified that I'm going to drop out because of the bandwidth. So pardon me for turning it off while I speak a little bit. And thanks so much to Jane for her elegant presentation. Really a lot of similarities between what Jane had to say and what my perspective is on this question. I mean, I would really say, Dina, that African women's rights organizations, they are creating knowledge and evidence all the time. And depending on the focus of the organization concerned, this would also include evidence and knowledge around violence against women prevention as well. And if we think about, the reasons why such organizations came into being in the first place, I think we would realize that their very ethos compels them to be knowledge creators and evidence creators. I mean, they can't help but do that. And so from my perspective, the real challenge is actually in the area of ensuring the uptake and utilization of the knowledge and the evidence that they've already created. If you think about it, I would say anyway, that African women's rights organizations, they tend to face a very subtle form of exclusion, which Jane touched on a little bit as well, at least from where I sit as a researcher. There's the tendency to pigeonhole such organizations in the name of quote unquote expertise. It becomes about what qualifies as expertise, who gets to decide what expertise is, who gets to decide who has it. And so invariably you'll find that African women's rights organizations are going to be excluded. And this isn't even solely about global positionings necessarily. So global North versus global South. It's about professional cultures and the hierarchies that exist in that domain. And these professional cultures, they teach us that women's rights organizations can only do certain things and not others, and that African women's rights organizations can do even less. Our various professional cultures, they're often about hurdles. And if you can scale the hurdle, then you deserve a promotion, or you deserve recognition, or you deserve a more privileged position. And if for some reason you can't, you just don't qualify. And we end up taking that process for granted. It is what it is. This is just how it's always been. And Jane touched on this as well, what she called the dominance of Northern research economies. I would like to extend that by pointing out that this dominance is inherited by Southern research economies. And then the cycle continues. So we apply this way of thinking to women's rights organizations as well. And the problem is that we don't realize how much we miss out on by doing so, and how much more our professions would be enriched by being open to different kinds of knowledge and evidence. And privilege is difficult to let go of.
Sorry,
So,
Chichi.
yes.
I would just like to chip in on that particular point that you were sharing to
Sure.
Bring in another voice that I think is also contributing to that. I would like to hear from Lucky just to chip in on that point that Chichi was sharing around inheriting dominant cycles, but just thinking about, Lucky, from your experience and bearing in mind the work that Raising Voices has extensively done on the continent around practice-based knowledge creation, dissemination. I think part of what Chichi mentioned was around uptake and use of knowledge. How can you describe some of the stories? What would be your take on some of the actual stories of African women in creation of knowledge over the years, based on your work, expertise, and experience? Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you so much, Chichi, for bringing us to this point. And from a personal perspective, the first time I heard the word evidence and knowledge creation and tried to read about it, it was something so complicated. You would not think that it is doable, or it's something that someone, a young professional that's just starting out, is able to understand. And I think a part of that, how I had prepared to speak to this has actually changed, because now I feel like I am more in touch, and it is more my experience with knowledge creation and evidence, is that I think that the description of what knowledge means changed with colonialism, because it just feels like whatever African women who are at the forefront, who have always been at the forefront of feminist movements, and all that knowledge they accumulated right from pre-colonial times. I am talking about really organized movements, like what we call the Nyabingi movement that was here, that was actually outlawed by the British because they said it was about witchcraft. And that has been used so many times for when African women organized, because they learned from our foremothers, our grandmothers, our ancestors about how to organize. But when colonialism came, it's like the description of what knowledge means, just in the general terms, changed. It's now about formal structures and schools and all these very complex technical things that have to be done, and that anything outside of that doesn't count as knowledge. And that's very disappointing, because now part of the ways that our African women, as us, we have been spreading our knowledge, we have been transferring our knowledge, has been repackaged and sold back to us. So now when donors want to fund your work, they will tell you, we need you to give us a story of what you have done in the communities. But African women have been telling stories since time immemorial. So they tell you, in that story, you have to sprinkle a bit of local language in there, and you have to put in a bit of song. But these are ways that we as African women have been using to transfer our knowledge from one generation to another. And we have been able to create movements right from, for example, the Nigerian women who rioted against also the British. And way before that, for example, the Ugandan women in Western Uganda who would try to protect young girls who were thrown off the cliff because they were pregnant. Those collectives constantly told stories, constantly sang songs, constantly had rituals, beautiful rituals, that with the changes in colonialism and the introduction of capitalism, that they are selling what is authentic to us and telling us that it's impossible. Like, how do you understand knowledge? You as a lay woman, you as someone who doesn't have 10 years experience or a PhD, how do you understand knowledge? So then that means that when they're going to fund organizations, researchers, they're going to fund top highly privileged organizations, privileged people. And
Thank you
then
so much. Lucky, I'm
Yes.
sorry to cut you,
Exactly.
but I really love the conversation, and I just wanted to bring in Ponso to pick up on your point around how we are, and again, linking to what Chichi shared, all of these cycles that we are building on and continuing to take forward. You raise important questions around what makes a compelling story. So what makes one method greater than another, etc. And Ponso, I think it would be great for you to share some reflections around this, seeing the work that the African Women's Development Fund is doing, convening African women and drawing on the points that Chichi and Lucky have highlighted. What could be preferably one or maximum two contributions that you see African women bringing to the table of knowledge and evidence creation in the context of violence against women prevention?
Thank you, Dina, and thank you to Chi-Chi and Lucky and to Jane. I feel just two is not going to do justice to the many contributions that African women and African feminists make to knowledge. I will try, however, and narrow it down. And I think the two that I will choose will in many respects be obvious. It's not about being complicated or scientific, but the two that I definitely would say is contextual specificity and understanding. We as African women know our experiences. We know what they mean, we know how to talk about them, we know how to communicate them. If as researchers you are visiting from the global north, and to many respects, I also think, you know, as researchers, if we are traditionally in urban areas and traveling to what I find are disparagingly referred to as the field or the communities, it's somehow, I think, delegitimizing the science that Lucky described about how generations of African women have defined what matters to them, what for them is a demonstration of progress and change and context and situation. So the first thing I would definitely say is contextual specificity and understanding. And sort of related to that, I think the second one that I would speak to is legitimacy. And I think we are privileged to be able to get an insight and an understanding to the lives that you know, the communities living and shaping their aspirations and their dreams. If we do not understand, if we do not respect, and if we do not absolutely co-collaborate, co-develop, and co-design how it is that we are going to frame the work, then there are questions about the legitimacy. There are questions about who is this serving, whose politics is this narrative contributing to? And when it is extractive, when it is about excluding ownership, when it is about excluding those communities unless they fit that external narrative, then I would say that there are questions around legitimacy. I think if I could just cheekily throw in one quote, I think that for me really sort of I always revert to, and it's a quote from Melistin and Faith Mkwananzi, and it says that acknowledging disparities in knowledge creation is a starting point for raising intellectual curiosity and awareness around gender stereotyping, racism, and power imbalances. And without acknowledging those, I think there are real questions about the validity of knowledge, wherever it's created and whoever it's created by.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ponso. And I think this segues into one other question that I would like to invite each of you to speak to. Just thinking about some of the points you've already highlighted around co-collaborations and thinking about what we are bringing to the table, and just inviting us panelists to speak to some key considerations that we need to integrate or think about if we are going to decenter the colonial gaze that faces us in this work that we are doing of prevention of violence against women. I would appreciate if each of us takes about a minute to just reflect on what would be the key considerations. Yeah, thank you.
I'm very happy to start, and I promise I'll try and do it in a minute. So this one might feel like a slightly odd one, but for me, it absolutely speaks to what Lucky shared about, who defines what is legitimate. And so I would say the key consideration is that as African women, we absolutely have confidence in what we know, that we have confidence to define it in the ways that matter to us, and that we don't feel obligated to define everything in ways that are external to who, what, and where we are. And most importantly, that don't speak to what it is that we want to say about our own lives.
Thank you so much, Lucky. Sorry, thank you so much, Ponso. And that's a very powerful point that you make there, that we're not being done a favor by, whatever we're saying. It's not that someone has to do us a favor to bring us to the table. It's emphasizing, as Lucky mentioned, and as you and Chichi have mentioned, this is work that we've been doing, and we are able to continue to do. So I'll just invite Lucky and Chichi in that order to share some thoughts on things to take forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. And I think for me, one of the things is decentering the colonial gaze itself is something we must do. And I think that speaks to what Ponso was saying. And just like a support bit will be to fund women's rights organizations who are actually doing the work. Because if we see how this approach, sorry, the word has refused. If we see how imbalanced it is, the funding that goes to like Global North researchers and people who are looking into the kind of work that African women are doing vis-a-vis the amount of money that goes to African women's rights organizations, it's just really sad. And I would like for us to center African women and our work, center us in the work, let us take lead, and let us legitimize our different ways of creating knowledge, of spreading knowledge. And yeah, because I know that we continue to create knowledge and we are able to, and like Ponsa said, we do know what we are doing and we can move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucky. Chichi, please.
Sure, Dina, I'll just pick it up from there. Lucky talked about taking the lead. And I just want to say, since we're talking about decolonization, we also need to talk about, well, what happens after colonization? Well, there's independence. And independence is about deciding what post-colonial life should look like and enacting it now that you have a certain level of freedom to make those decisions. So it's about creating new rules and cultures, and that's part of what we need to consider. Shifting the center takes work. It doesn't just happen. It takes deliberate planning and actions, and oftentimes on the part of both the quote unquote colonized and the quote unquote colonizer. And most people end up being in one of those categories through no fault of their own. But what history demonstrates is that to change this sort of situation, you need a willingness from both parties to pull their weight and to sort of proactively push in order to change the status quo. And I really see this guide as being a part of that process. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our dear panelists. And I think at this point, I would like to even make the interaction bigger by opening the question and answer, just for us to continue briefly. We've run out of time. Apologies about that. But I'm just picking one of the questions that stands out for me in the chat. And I think it's from Sibongile. And Sibo says, this is interesting, but who is an African woman? Are we homogenizing African women? Are we homogenizing women? Are women one block? And I think I will invite Lucky, if you would love to speak to that. That would be great. And I'll pick a few more questions and share them. Please, Enami, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that. And I do agree that it's very important that we do not simplify the identity of African women. But I think that also our identity as well is quite blunt. And so there is who an African woman is, and there is who an African woman is not. So even under the bracket of African women, there's diversity, and that's the beauty about it. The different shades of African women, the different sexual orientations, the different preferences. But I just want to say that definitely you are either born an African woman or you're not. But even within that kind of bracket of African women, there is a diversity that we must always respect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucky. There is another question, comment in the Q&A. I agree 100%, and this is from Mieka Polanco, and I agree 100% with the need to decolonize knowledge by speaking in an authentic voice, trusting one's own, the knowledge base, etc. But that also often leaves women who sound different out of the room where colonial decisions are being made. It speaks to Spivak conundrum, can the subaltern speak? And I think it goes still to the point of diversity, but also in a way that we are breaking the barriers, going to the margins to make sure that what we are calling inclusivity is not so answering the question, inclusivity for who? Is it us continuing the privileges and bringing certain groups of women based on whether or not they fit into the description, like Lucky was mentioning, of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, who has access to what platform, etc. But I'm flagging that for the panelists. We're going to be closing the panel and the Q&A in a bit because I don't seem to see more questions popping up. Lizo, Malaika, if I've missed any questions, that would be great for you to highlight. I think there are more comments than questions, and a lot of Lizo, would you please read the question? I don't seem to see it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dina. We had another question from Sibongile saying, are white African women African women?
I would love to invite, so Jen, I know you made a presentation earlier, but as part of the Q&A, a lot of these questions were also, cutting across, and I wanted to invite you if you would speak to the question and also the other panelists, just because you haven't spoken in response to the questions.
Thanks, Dina, and thanks, Sibongile, for the question. I'm going to give an answer that I'm not sure will be easy. Sibongile, for me, the brief answer is no. And that, I work in a lot of different circles, and I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that when one takes a naming, a reference as political in the way that Lucky did, one also takes it as a celebration, as an achievement, as something that has been politically worked for. And I think the term African women or African woman isn't actually about necessarily being born in somewhere on the continent. It's about the huge political work of feeling and thinking and being and living that has led the idea of an African woman as the source of knowledge that can take anybody anywhere, can take us anywhere. And that point, and no, that's not somebody racialized as white. It's just not. Other conversations might be had as like, okay, Jane, what are you doing here? But that wasn't the question asked. I know that many white women theorize and write a lot about how their racialization should not, in a way, disqualify them from this political achievement of the meaning of African women. So many centuries, such depth. But I think that's just cowardice. You know, white women are constructed in direct relation to egregious oppression of African women. I live in South Africa, and we often talk about, oh, I'm going on for too long again, Dina. There's a right thing for you. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, thank you, but thank you so much for those reflections, and I won't add or remove anything from them. I will just add one last question, and it's how do we remember to understand patriarchal violence as harmful to not only women, but non-conforming folks too? I think that's one of the questions, and I will invite Chichi and Ponso, if you'd like to speak to this, and then we'll wrap up the panel. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. I mean, I think we have a long way to go when it comes to that issue. I think it is becoming increasingly acknowledged that gender is much more complex than, you know, the field, in quotes, allowed it to be. But, you know, I am seeing increasingly more acknowledgement. And I think that part of what we need to do as those who contribute to the so-called field is to highlight this more, write about it more, use this more in our tools, and so on and so forth, in our surveys. And as we do that, that really is, you know, how issues becomes normalized, quote unquote, within the field. It begins with, you know, a number of people starting to do it until it really takes root. And I see it happening little by little, but we are definitely not there yet by any means. Thanks.
Thank you, Chichi. Ponso?
I think Chichi probably said everything that I would have said, and I think this again speaks to, you know, we as African women and as gender expansive peoples identify who we are and what matters to us. So in the same way that we speak about, you know, sort of, let's say visitors coming in, researching us and going, you know, taking away what is important to them, we cannot replicate those behaviors within our own communities. And I think it is very much as the African Women's Development Fund, for us, being able to support the work of groups that have been historically marginalized, with one of the biggest of those being what are described as, and again, there's politics around the terminology, but gender non-conforming groups. For us, you know, we do use women in the broadest sense, but we absolutely, when we are looking at what we do, why we do it and how we do it, wanting to ensure that those groups that are marginalized absolutely are a core and a priority in the work that we do. So it is about us being able to listen, but more importantly, to hear, and then to ensure that our response is supportive and appropriate.
Thank you so much, Ponso. And thank you so much to the audience for the amazing questions, the comments. I think they continue to come. We are going to shortly be listening to one of our colleagues who is going to point us to how we will continue this conversation. And we know that we're going to be doing several things to just make sure that this doesn't end here, but I would like to give a very big thanks to the speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Apologies for running you around with time management and all of that. But this brings us to the end of the panel conversation. And I would like to invite Laurie to just, Lizzo, sorry, to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I've just been so overwhelmed by this such rich and wonderful conversation, and feel really honoured to be a part of it and part of this. The SVRI is deeply grateful to be able to assist in the dissemination of this really important knowledge and evidence guide. And we're deeply grateful for the invitation from AWDF and the collaboration with Raising Voices to do so. I really want to highlight how important such discussions are, and violence against women, as we all know, is a super complex problem, and it requires all of us to do our part. And the AWF's guide is a real open invitation to African feminist organisations and activists to identify ways in which they can contribute to violence against women prevention and response. As the guide notes, and I'm going to talk directly to what the guide says, knowledge creation and evidence generation are the lifeblood of powerful organisational and activist work on violence against women prevention. Sharing the many valuable resources and new offerings, creating opportunities for cross-organisational partnerships like this one, celebrating new and familiar discoveries, and encouraging documentation, writing, art making, and visual digital productivity is critical. In this spirit, we invite you all to share links to the work of African feminist organisations and activists working on the continent to end violence against women, and other important work that you're aware of. So if you could really share those links in the chat, we'd be super welcome, and we'll bring them all together and share them on our various websites. And we'd also like to encourage you to attend other important events like this one, and including the SVRI Forum, where you can showcase the important work that's being done. We really need to get this work out there. Moving forward as a group, AWDF, Raising Voices, and the SVRI are going to publish knowledge products to support the launch of both this guide and other work that's being done. But that will include blogs, media products, and stories that we've spoken about and how important they are. And they are an important part of knowledge generation. This webinar has been recorded, and I think someone asked about that, and will be shared online. And in closing, I'd really like to thank AWDF for this guide and for its potential contribution to the work we all do. I'd like to thank this incredibly wonderful panel for the rich and insightful discussions. And I'd really also like to thank the colleagues who led yesterday's really successful Twitter chat, and I'm sure we can share links to that chat in the chat. And the teams from AWDF, SVRI, and Raising Voices, who created and delivered such an engaging and creative event. Thank you all. And finally, thank you to all of you who have participated in this event, for all the work that you do to prevent violence against women and spending time with us today. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dina.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. We are grateful for your contributions. And as Liz mentioned, we are going to be doing quite more. And we know, even though it's not yet November, December, the 16 days of activism will be here. So there's quite a lot that's upcoming. And yeah, let me not add to the closing. Thanks, everybody. Have yourself a wonderful morning, a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, and we shall be in touch. We'll share all of the materials as follow-up, as Liz mentioned. But yeah, thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Bye all. That was fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.